In my visionary novel, IKONA, there's a quotation for part 3 that reads, "The crossing is the shattering place where the one becomes the many." This quotation comes from chapter 26 of my novel, called The Bridge, which is a story within the story, but more importantly for today's episode, this is of course a metaphor. Without spoiling the novel, this shattering place refers to a choice point, a timeline event, when the timeline is shattering, and in the moment of shattering, multiple futures open up. This is today's topic. Hi, I'm Michelle Dixon, and welcome back to The Shattering Place, the podcast that explores the living science and true stories of multidimensionality in service to healing, awakening, and the evolution of consciousness. We have already explored the body as a portal, the relational field of the shared mind, and the deep river of our ancestors. Most recently, in the last episode, episode 5, we looked ahead at the future memory, the realization that the blueprint for a new human species is already reaching back from the future to guide us today. But if we are to become true citizens of a multidimensional Earth, we can't only look at the light. We must have the courage to look at the wreckage. So today we continue the journey with episode 6, The Death of the Old World. In this episode, we move into the 6th threshold, the collective shadow. It's vital to let you know at the outset that this is a must-listen episode that grounds collapse in possibility and offers a new perspective on current global events. We are stepping out of the love and light bubble to look at the geopolitics of collapse and the non-benign forces resisting our evolution. Essentially, this is about the labor pains of a planet, and the most grounded question of all, can you stay in your body while the old world dissolves? What if the current global chaos is the necessary clearing of the ground for new architecture? We've been here before, right? So what is different now? We've had world wars, nuclear threats. We've experienced genocide in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, even in fairly recent decades. So what makes this all different? Many say that we are navigating a polycrisis, a dense layering of systemic failures where climate instability, economic volatility, and the erosion of social trust all intersect and all influence each other like a giant interconnected web in which tugging on one bit of the web sends ripples throughout the whole. Well, what I see is that this is all the natural, messy consequence of old world structures reaching their natural limits. The gears of the horizontal track, that linear time I mentioned on episode 5, are grinding to a halt. They have reached the end of their design capacity. I hold a firm boundary here. I am witnessing the current horrors, the wars, the bombings, the genocides, environmental collapse, to name but a few, as profound violations of the human spirit. These are the symptoms of the great unraveling, a term coined by the activist Joanna Macy. In her framework, we are living through the inevitable breakdown of a worldview that treats the earth, as she said, as a supply house and a sewer. This collapse is the functional precursor to what she named the Great Turning. We have to begin here with the phenomena. So, in this episode, I'm asking first, what's actually happening here? And then, how are people reacting to it? And a little bit of why. But finally, I will ask, how can we do this better? However, I'm not asking this as a moral question, like, come on, everyone, we need to protest. I am inquiring into questions of self-preservation and evolution. That is, how can we do this better with an intention to evolve, to facilitate a positive future, and to make a difference? First, what is actually happening? We know the landscape of the current shattering. We are witnessing the brutal reality of wars, the acceleration of environmental collapse, and the fraying of the economic and social safety nets that once felt like solid ground. But to move through this without collapsing under the weight of the data, we need a bird's eye view. We need a conceptual container that allows us to stay conscious and functional rather than becoming paralyzed by the debris. From a meta perspective and borrowing a physics term, we might say that we are in the middle of a systemic phase transition. And I love to research lots of areas of inquiry to understand how, in a holographic sense, all systems are mirrors of each other. So, in physics, phase transition is what occurs when a system undergoes a fundamental shift in its symmetry and organization, like water turning to steam. Near the critical point, the system reaches a state of maximum fluctuation and instability. The equilibrium of the old state has broken down, and the stability of the new state has yet to emerge. This does seem to be what we are experiencing, the extreme turbulence of a dying worldview, which is, of course, materialism, as I unpacked in episode 1 of this series. We might also understand this as the exhaustion of the horizontal path. In the last episode, we defined this horizontal track as the realm of linear time, the belief that the future is just a sequence of more of the same and that progress is a straight line. The vertical path, by contrast, is the dimension of the present moment, where we access depth, intuition, and non linear shifts in consciousness. So, for centuries, our global architecture has been built on the promise of infinite linear growth on a finite planet. We have tried to solve every problem by walking further down the same hallway. This is familiar to everyone when we think of economics, right? Using up all of our resources. The shattering is the moment that this hallway, this horizontal path, hits a wall. It is a crisis of dimension. Those who talk about 5D consciousness might say it's a crisis of the third and fourth dimensions. In any case, our horizontal structures, our financial systems, our extractive industries, our top down hierarchies, they do seem to have reached their maximum complexity. They can no longer solve the problems they created simply by moving forward. Does this mean they are undergoing a necessary breakdown because they have run out of room in this linear plane? I think so. And I also think that this meta view I've just described for us is empowering. It changes our role in the story. We are witnesses to a structural evolution. This is a birth canal architecture, like I mentioned in the last episode. The pressure and the chaos are the specific environmental conditions required to force us off this exhausted horizontal path and onto a vertical axis. Now, this might be a good time to remind listeners that these episodes of The Shattering Place, Season 1, they form an arc, and it's helpful to have listened to episodes 1 to 5 before diving further here, because in episode 5, I went into the more mystical conception of what horizontal versus vertical time is. Vertical time being kairos, the present moment, that mystical moment that can access an infinite now. Anyway, back to today's topic. We are being squeezed out of a two-dimensional way of living and into a multi-dimensional way of being. For some time now, the concept of a planetary shift, often called ascension or the move from 3D to 5D reality, has dominated the cultural conversation. I intend to unpack the mechanics of awakening in our next episode, episode 7, but for now, I want to address how this movement functions in the collective. This is a kind of tricky conversation for me because while I find that the underlying physics of a frequency shift feels sound as far as I understand the potential science involved. The delivery of this shift often becomes a vehicle for the ego to become incredibly special. The part of us clinging to a desire for relevance loves these movements because they offer a comparative sense of worth. Online, this choice is frequently presented as a selective event, a split, where those with the right frequency ascend while the rest of us are left behind. It's important to understand that this narrative is a direct descendant of the Christian concept of the rapture. We see this reflected in the theology of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe exactly 144,000 anointed individuals will rule in heaven, or in mainstream dispensationalist views, where the saved are physically removed before the apocalypse. When we export this us versus them blueprint into spiritual circles, it risks becoming a means of spiritual bypassing. Focusing on the promise of a 5D future helps us avoid the reality of the current 3D shattering. My position is that this shift is not exclusive. There is nothing special about it. The choice point is not about being chosen, it's about how much we're willing to be honest with ourselves and cultivate self awareness. It's the decision to stop living in the shadow of denial or perpetuating cycles of projection and anger. Evolution is the foundational way of the world, it's not optional. The choice is not if we will change, but when. And the choice point is simply this: will you align with your capacity for growth and coherence now, or will you remain stuck in the mechanical density of the old frequency for a while longer? Essentially, as I will unpack shortly, we cannot have a planetary shift without a planetary shattering. The symptoms of the old must reach a point of critical failure for a new system to emerge. We are currently in that tectonic shift where the ground we stand on is being reclaimed and repurposed. This process follows a consistent historical and biological blueprint. Significant evolution is almost always preceded by a period of profound disorganization. We see this in the Industrial Revolution, a time of immense social and structural shattering. The agrarian, localized systems that had sustained humanity for centuries were dismantled, leading to massive urbanization, the collapse of traditional labor roles, and period of deep instability. While the transition was fraught with hardship, it was the specific kind of chaos required to birth a completely new technological and social architecture. The Industrial Revolution laid the foundation for the technological revolution and the modern economy we are in, shifting populations from largely agrarian to urbanized, interconnected masses, a transition that forced a collective recalibration from, for example, a rhythmic seasonal existence to a fast paced, linear, and eventually digital reality. We are seeing a similar systemic exhaustion today, but on a global, multidimensional scale. The breakdown of our current institutions, our fossil fuel based energy, our centralized financial models, our extractive relationship with nature, is this perhaps a sign that the system has reached its natural conclusion? So let's look at it from a few different perspectives, from a few different fields of inquiry, starting with economics, where collapse has been seen again and again and analyzed endlessly. In economics, there's this idea of creative destruction. It's a bit of a cold corporate way of saying that for something new to grow, the old version has to die. But the problem with this view is that it's usually obsessed with profit, right? Still, studies in economics, especially regarding large corporate entities, have name to state that these experts call institutional inertia. This is the tendency of a mature organization to resist change, even when that change is a matter of survival. This perspective helped give rise to the startup industry, for example, which functions as kind of like a workaround to this stagnation. Because big systems are often too rigid to pivot, startups intentionally stay small, at least initially, and disruptive to bypass the heavy, slow moving gears of more established industry. There's also a growing movement to decentralize management, a move away from the top down kind of like command control system of the industrial age towards a more kind of flat or networked based structure. The idea is that if the power is distributed rather than hoarded at the top, the system stays more flexible and can respond to shatterings, to evolution without the whole thing collapsing. The economics view is that we're stuck in what's called a cultural lock in. Cultural lock in. This term actually comes from evolutionary economics and technology studies. It describes how a society can get stuck using an inferior or outdated systems like fossil fuels, for example, simply because we've already invested so much into it that the cost of change feels too high. Fossil fuels are the obvious example of this. But here's a fun example I discovered when researching this podcast episode. So, your keyboard layout and mine is known as QWERTY, the QWERTY layout. It's the one we all use. It was actually designed in the 1870s to keep old typewriter arms from jamming. So, early typewriters used mechanical type bars. So, there were long metal arms with a character at each end. When you pressed a key, the corresponding bar would swing up to strike an inked ribbon against the paper. The problem was that if you typed two letters that were physically close to each other, where the bars rested in quick succession, right? The arms would frequently collide and jam before they could strike the paper. So the keyboard had to be designed so that the letters that are most often typed together wouldn't strike together and therefore jam. So, of course, now, like I'm typing on my Mac, and so are you and your computer, but what I learned in high school was the QWERTY layout. So even though we have much faster, more comfortable ways to type today, but we're stuck with this 19th century design because the cultural lock-in is just too deep. The cost of retraining billions of people's muscle memory feels higher than the benefit of actually fixing the system. So this is a good example of how we can stay trapped in a broken way of doing things simply because that old way got there first. On a larger scale, what this looks like is that we are using maps for a world that doesn't exist anymore. And the systems we built to keep us safe are now the very things keeping us trapped. Hmm. Sounds like just what I said about the paradigm of materialism from episode 1, doesn't it? Now, if we step out of the corporatist economic examples and into biology, stepping into the garden, the perspective changes and we can start to witness how systems work without the pressure of efficiency and profit. Because, of course, the fossil fuels example and the QWERTY keyboard example are all about how stagnation is desired because change would cost too much money, right? But in biology, growth is a process that is messy and chaotic and has nothing to do with efficiency and profit. So look at a caterpillar in a chrysalis. It completely dissolves into a soup rather than just transforming. It has to lose its entire identity, its legs, its way of eating, its shape, before it can become something that flies. This is metamorphosis. The biological blueprint here is clear. You can't move into the next stage of your life if you're still carrying the skeleton of the last one. And it makes me wonder what happens to corporatism in all of this change? Can we really expect these massive rigid structures to just slowly iterate their way into a new world? Or like we see in so many other systems, will there simply come a day when the weight of the old way becomes too much and the whole thing just collapses? I will be looking for people who can speak to this in the area of corporate life. Like, I'm very curious, like, how can we evolve out of corporations and corporatism? Let's get to a somatic lens now and talk about the body's way of evolving and recalibrating. So, from a somatic lens, we see collapse as an indicator of a nervous system that simply reached its capacity. Collapse is the body's way of saying that the current operating system can no longer handle the load. I use a lot of metaphors in my work with my clients as well, depending on the person. I might describe the nervous system as a circuitry board or, an operating system. But in any case, when we're under extreme pressure, we often go into a freeze state. It's a kind of psychological lock in where we're just surviving, not living. The shattering here is often a literal breaking open of the breath or a release of stored tension. It feels like chaos in the moment. So there might be shaking, heat, tears, pain, but it's actually the body's way of clearing out old trauma to make room for a more flexible, resilient way of being. It's about feeling more ultimately. But why is the collapse necessary? To understand that, we can also look at nonlinear thermodynamics and complexity science. So bear with me for a moment. I had to do this research, and it's really some very good metaphors and examples of how this works. Because in these fields, scientists talk about a state called dynamic disequilibrium. This is the idea that a system stays vital specifically because it's off balance. Or to put it another way, total stability is actually a sign of stagnation. We don't want things to stay the same. Change is growth, change is evolution. Let me make this really concrete from you. The transition from the horse and buggy to the engine. The old world of how we moved around was limited by the physical capacity of an animal. The entire industry had to fracture because you couldn't just improve a horse until it was as fast as a car. The old architecture had to fall apart to make room for a completely different scale of power and speed. So, no matter the context, whether in economics, corporatism, science, the body, society itself, collapse, or as I keep calling it, the shattering, is the proof that the system is finally, painfully forcing itself to evolve. But now I'm going to segue a bit. I'm going to segue into the how of collapse and change and revisit biology, or specifically a vital historical observation in the field of biology from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm going to tell you about Pyotr Kropotkin. I mention him in my novel IKONA. I'll tell you why in a moment, but Pyotr Kropotkin was a biologist and a geographer. And he was also a famous anarchist whose contributions are becoming, I think, increasingly relevant as our current systems fracture. Kropotkin wrote in direct response to the social Darwinist who applied theories of brutal competition to human society. And the reason he wrote in response to them is because he was a scientist, a biologist. He did loads of studies on animal life, flora and fauna. And as a scientist, he observed a different primary driver of survival than Darwin did. And he called it mutual aid. Kropotkin identified collaboration, not competition, as the dominant biological force in the animal kingdom and human history. In his view, centralized top down structures are merely historical interruptions that stifle this natural instinct. He says, basically, he said that species that collaborate survive. Kropotkin believed that when these massive rigid systems fracture under their own weight, they reveal a resilient web of human connection underneath. I remember discovering Kropotkin's work as an undergraduate when I was studying international relations. At the time, he was treated as little more than a footnote in history, but his research, his biological research, blew my mind. It was one of the first times that I realized that science doesn't always move towards objective truth. It evolves rather under the pressure of pre existing paradigms and the social systems that fund it. Kropotkin's observations of cooperation were less convenient for an industrial world built on hierarchy, and so the Darwinian focus on competition won. History remembers Darwin, not Kropotkin. Realizing that science is often steered by the very systems of influences it claims to measure, that was a personal turning point for me. It was the moment that I stopped assuming that there was only truth in textbooks, right, and conventional education. It's when I started looking for truth elsewhere, and eventually in the lived somatic reality of myself and other people. However, I want to be clear about something here. I am not an anarchist or a capitalist or any kind of ist. Despite my early academic background in the social sciences and international relations, I stand firmly in the consciousness space today. When I look at Kropotkin's work, although I take on board that for some, historically, it's he does have political manifestos. I'm actually looking at his work on the physiology of connection. To me, mutual aid is about intrinsic order. It's the biological truth that when the top-down structures we've relied on finally shatter, we don't fall into a vacuum. We fall into community. We fall into each other. This holds more weight for me because it's not about looking for a better way to do business. It's looking for a better way to be human. It's about recalibrating the very biology of how we relate. It reminds us that the tribal reality where survival depended on the collective nervous system is all about this intrinsic order. It's about this intrinsic order of the spontaneous neighbor to neighbor networks that, for example, appear during a flood or a fire long before the official trucks arrive. It's all about an invisible safety net that has been there all along, just waiting for specific circumstances to finally be seen. I believe that this is the frequency of the new human, grounded, collaborative, and focused on the vertical axis of what is biologically and spiritually possible right now. Much of the Ascension or 5D talk online is simply an attempt, I think, to reform capitalism, but wearing a spiritual mask, an attempt to feel special while avoiding the work of true systemic change. Yet, I have to wonder, is the current shattering of our centralized architecture the opening for this biological necessity of cooperation to re-emerge? Might we be moving towards a more collaborative human reality that has been there all along, but just has been obscured by modern life, by the structures and systems of competition that have been, sanctioned and layered upon us? We have to be careful here. I'm not calling for a love and light utopia. If we're truly going to inhabit a collective reality, we can't walk around the rubble to get there. We have to walk through it. It's time to meet the shadows and go beyond the bypass. So, the darkness, the shadows, the parts of our collective and private lives we simply do not want to see. Beyond the material power structures and our shared beliefs, this darkness exists, and we have to face the reality of it in order to move past it, to evolve out of it. To what extent have we willfully turned a blind eye to the shadow in our midst? The popular 5D or ascension narratives rarely touch on this. Instead, they offer a form of spiritual bypassing that suggests we can simply vibrate at a higher frequency to make the darkness disappear. But meeting this head on, this darkness, really being with it and accepting its existence, that is how we weave the full spectrum of reality into our being. First, before I name some things, I need to ask the question, why do we feel the need to turn away? We see collective shock when things like the Epstein files come to light, when events in Gaza come to light. Yet, even a cursory look at modern history reveals the persistent dark side of the human condition. In 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, the Hutu and Tutsi populations, neighbors who had lived, worked, socialized together for generations, turned on one another with visceral violence. Friends and neighbors were suddenly participating in massacres, using farm tools like machetes to commit atrocities against people they had known their entire lives. Have we also forgotten the genocide in the former Yugoslavia? And look, there are other examples. One of the reasons I left my social sciences background is that it seemed like history disastrously repeated itself, and no amount of studying it would solve it. I moved into therapeutic work partly because I felt I could have more of an impact here. Abuse, too, is woven into the human experience. Rape and patriarchal systems that normalize abuse, these are not new. Perhaps you've heard of the case of Giselle Pellicot in France, which has just exposed the horrific extreme of this systemic lock-in, where for a decade, her husband drugged her into unconsciousness and invited dozens of strangers from the internet to rape her in their home. Over 50 men have been identified as participating, and they're currently on trial, though investigators believe the total number of participants over that decade was closer to 80 or 90. And what is perhaps most chilling about this story, and I'm sharing it because many of us maybe were aware of some of the scandals that have happened with Epstein and so on in the States, and this happened in France. But I think it's important to name that this is a global phenomenon, this phenomenon of, illusions crashing down and patriarchy being revealed. But perhaps what is most chilling is that these men who raped her, they were largely local and so-called ordinary members of the community, neighbors, fathers, professionals from the surrounding Vaucluse region in southern France, including a journalist, electrician, even a local counselor. So the fact that so many men participated in this drugging and rape without question highlights a chilling statistical reality. The statistics in France are very similar to those in the US and Australia. About 3 out of 10 women and roughly 1 out of 10 boys experience sexual violence. It's a big number. All this proves that while the capacity for abuse is a dark thread in the human experience, a patriarchal system that normalizes the silencing of victims is perhaps specifically engineered as an architecture of control. And more, this is coming to light. We know that abuse is often an intergenerational pattern, but I think we're only beginning to realize how dark this is. And I'm not going to give you any details of the things that happen, just cite some facts here. But since the 90s, specific cohorts of psychologists have documented the reality of ritualistic and systemic abuse, satanic ritual sexual abuse. In her book, Healing the Unimaginable, Dr. Allison Miller outlines the profound complexity of treating survivors of such organized cult and state sponsored trauma. And yes, I have had clients who have navigated this, survived this. And this is unfortunately not exceptional, and it's certainly not modern. It's in suburban neighborhoods, in the shadow hallways of power, in the closeted private dungeons of family systems where children continue to be harmed and were harmed a decade ago, and 2 decades ago, and 100 years ago, etc. We have to ask ourselves, what have we been denying, and how can we strengthen our hearts to see this truth more clearly? Here's the thing. If we can't look at the devastation in the world, the active wars, the systemic poverty, the loops of violence, etc., we remain braced against our own internal shattering. To be fully human is to acknowledge the entire spectrum of what we're capable of. I'm not saying that each of us could perpetrate in such a horrific manner, but rather that each of us has our own shadow side. And when we refuse to see the shadow in the collective, we lose the ability to navigate the shadow in ourselves. This looking away comes with a high price. When we are in denial about the dark side of our psyche, whether it's the toxicity of the patriarchy or the rot in our institutions, we become desperate for a savior. We end up projecting our own unhealed traumas onto enlightened figures, putting them on a pedestal only to watch them inevitably fall from grace. We've seen this time and again with public spiritual leaders who were once untouchable, but were eventually revealed to be deeply flawed. And I'm sure we all know some of those figures who've been named recently. When we pedestal others, we are actually disregarding our own internal guidance system. We hand over our power because we're too afraid to look at the darkness ourselves. But by being honest about how fragmented our world has become, we find the opportunity not to succumb to despair, but to find a fierce, grounded determination. We have the opportunity here to realize that being the light doesn't mean ignoring the dark. It means holding others' guidance lightly, refusing to put anyone on a pedestal, and dialing back into our own internal authority. It's only by facing the shadow that we stop blindly putting our faith in toxic leaders and start finding the light we actually need inside ourselves. And it means attending to the healing, the growing up parts, the healing of our childhood wounds, our conditioned selves, and not just trying to wake up to speak a spiritual ascension, but also to start to grow up. This brings me to the hero's journey, a concept popularized by the mythologist Joseph Campbell in the mid 20th century. Campbell observed that across all cultures, the path to self actualization requires a descent into the abyss. You cannot reach the transformation without first facing the dragon in the cave. The personal shattering, the crisis that breaks your identity, is the fundamental requirement for the journey. You go through the fire to find the version of yourself that can't be burned. Change never happens without pressure. I think of the tower in the tarot deck, a crown topped stone building being struck by lightning, engulfed in flames, with two figures falling headfirst towards the jagged rocks below. This card represents a sudden, jarring collapse of a structure that was built on a shaky foundation. When you are in the middle of a divorce, it's hard to imagine it's the necessary path to a different kind of love. When you're fired and facing financial stress, suffering is total. Devastation often precedes the breakthrough because you can only plant the seeds of the new in the rubble of the old. Having navigated my own shatterings, including divorce, periods of intense financial struggle, working with my childhood wounds around abandonment, and all of these things, I am the first to admit that when it sucks, it just sucks. There's no getting around it. You can't think your way out of stress and devastation. You can only experience it, which brings me to the value of living through it. The truth is, the only way out is through. This is a persistent quirk of the human psyche that we just can't think our way past a shattering. We have to live it. This is the foundation of past life hypnotherapy and the emotional catharsis we see in deep somatic work. We feel our way out of things. It reminds me of accounts from near death experiences where the individuals describe a sudden realization that their most painful moments had a profound kind of function, if you will. The wisdom wasn't found in overcoming grief or poverty, but rather there was wisdom in the sheer deep experience of it. It's the insight of living fully, even when that living is devastating. This is admittedly no solace to a linear mind, and I'm not speaking to gratitude, and certainly not in a superficial sense, but I am saying that there's something about the experience itself that must be lived, felt, to be integrated. On the global stage, I believe that human history follows this same iterative pulse. We don't just repeat the past. We re-encounter the same fundamental tensions at higher levels of complexity until the existing container shatters under the pressure of its own contradictions. It's structural exhaustion. Our old mental, rational way of life, the world of industrialism and strict linear logic, eventually hits a wall where it can no longer solve the problems it creates. The shattering is the release valve that allows a new integral structure to form. I believe this dismantling and the chaos that follows is essentially a fierce evolutionary pressure designed to break down what no longer serves the field. It's not a love and light bypass. It's not a moralizing view where only the virtuous ascend. I'm simply stating the case for the inevitable rebuilding that follows collapse. Whether this unfolds as violent destruction or a gradual series of recalibrations, I can't say. And I don't know if anyone can say. But as I explore in the thematic spine of my novel, IKONA, there is a choice point. a specific resonance or transmission one can hold that tangibly affects the outcome. This means that we must turn to how we are actually reacting to this mess in the world and how we might do it better. When the system begins to shatter, the human nervous system reacts in predictable yet wildly different ways. For many in the Western first world context, the primary response is a profound freeze. We see this in the rising tide of apathy. We see it in doom scrolling paralysis and a desperate retreat into digital echo chambers. This is where we see the increasing rise of the far right and extreme polarization. For many people, when they feel the ground disappearing beneath them, they seek safety in rigid hierarchies, nationalism, exclusion of the other, in a frantic attempt to reestablish a sense of control that no longer exists. Contrast this with the response of those living in the center of the crisis, whether in the streets of Iran, the streets of America, the front lines of climate displacement, wherever that center is. Often, in contrast, the luxury of freezing is gone. Instead, we see a raw, ancestral survival instinct kick in that bypasses old, rigid institutions entirely. We see uprisings, we see protests in the streets that often aren't reported in mainstream news, but they're happening. We see collaborative local activism, collaborative national activism, and decentralized sovereign movements emerging precisely because the traditional routes to power are failing us. No matter what we do, though, we can't just think or protest our way through this. Not everyone has the ability to become an activist, though so many people, and perhaps many of you listening now, desperately want to be part of a solution, part of a new kind of earth. The activist and scholar Joanna Macy reminds us in her work that we must have the courage to feel these enormous changes in the world, the great turning, as she called it. She famously argued that our pain for the world is inseparable from our love for the world. She wrote that we can't numb the grief without also numbing the very love that is required to build the new. Macy suggested that the shattering is actually an invitation to come back into a state of active hope. Those were her words, active hope, not a passive belief that things will be fine, but the practice of becoming the transition of ourselves, becoming that which we want to see. What then does this collapse from the shadows of our history to the crumbling of our current institutions actually demand of our inner world? What does it demand of our inner world? I believe that the inner world must become more disciplined, not less. You can't navigate a stormy sea in a leaking boat. The new human, if I just pick a term to describe how a human might be post-collapse, this new human must be a navigator in a new world and not just the survivor of the old one. And the mental shift from survival to navigation is a big one. I get it, especially when there's so much hopelessness and confusion. I can tell you from working with individuals who have navigated their own private collapse and rebuilding that this kind of shift demands presence. It requires three things specifically that I've identified, and I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in future episodes. But it demands, first of all, somatic regulation, the ability to hold the charge of global grief without shattering ourselves. Radical honesty, the courage to look at the shadows and our own internal shadows without turning away. And collaborative intelligence, so that mutual aid that Kropotkin observed, building resilient networks of care that can function when large-scale systems fail. As Khalil Gibran wrote, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. The shattering is the breaking of the shell. I believe that we're being asked to hold a resonance that can withstand this pressure, that we must become the steady transmission of that future frequency, as I talked about in episode 5. Become that transmission in a world that has forgotten its own heartbeat. So that brings us to the end of this episode, in which we haven't looked away from the shattering. We've faced the collective shadow and the death of these non-benign systems through different paradigms and disciplines, and we've realized that the upheaval we see in the world, which is the upheaval I wrote into the pages of my novel IKONA, is a fierce evolutionary pressure designed to dismantle what no longer serves the field. But as the outer world dissolves, the inner world must become more disciplined. We can't navigate a storm in a leaking boat. In our next episode, episode 7, Ascension and Awakening, the Discipline of Embodiment, we move into the 7th threshold. We're going to talk about ascension, but not the way you've heard it before. We're moving away from floating away or consciousness shifts towards a radical embodiment. I'm going to share why the craft of being a human is similar to the craft of being a rider. It requires a mastery of the subtle body and a commitment to groundedness, actually. We'll explore the discovery that pulling the infinite down into your cells requires a tight ship, a nervous system that can hold high voltage multidimensionality without burning out. And I'm going to ask you, is your vessel ready to carry the weight of your own soul? And we'll explore a bit what I even mean when I say that. We'll meet again soon at the edges of the known. Just a quick word about working with me one-on-one. My traditional clinical practice is currently at capacity, but I am offering a few spots per month for my 90-day program. It's a one-on-one container. You work with me personally, and it sits outside the traditional clinical model, which allows me to bring my full multidimensional toolkit from somatic rewiring to evolutionary astrology directly into your process. So there is information in the show notes, and you can apply down below. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And if you've got to the end, I would love it if you left a star rating and even a review and followed the show. This is the end of episode 6. We have 3 more to go for season 1, and then we have interviews coming up. Have a great week, everyone.
Om apadamapahattaram dattaram sarvasampadam lokabhiraman shriराman bhuyo bhuyo namamyama Om apadamapahattaram dattaram sarva